There is no argument that all cultures have something to describe the absolute, and all cultures have explored the reason and value of our being in the world. Sometimes the description of the terms for the absolute in different cultures resonate with each other, and we tend to appreciate these similarities. Our social reality is also such that we are getting more and more interconnected, and our cultural differences are becoming marginal forces in light of our business and political interests. But there is something more sinister than these simple social expectations. Cultural colonialism does not require a flat-out denial of other cultures. It can subsume others and reframe the experiences from other cultures within the parameters of the colonizing culture. If the first is a product of naive perennialism, the latter reflects the discourse crafted by missionaries and the gurus. On the one hand, addressing the constructive role of culture and language, we come to the other pole of the argument that we live in separate cultural islands. Both faith leaders and the scholarly community have contributed to the misconceptions by blurring the boundaries. While some scholars, for instance Raimundo Panikkar, have warned us that Brahman is certainly not the one true and living God of the Abrahamic traditions, nor can it be said that Shakti or Kami are the same as Brahman, and yet they are not totally unrelated. The categories Brahman, Īśvara and God have been constantly blurred with the titles such as How to Know God, Against the Hindu God. On the other spectrum of the scene, the consumer market is taken by the fever of perennialist categories that has led to the unique vocabulary such as God realization or spiritual awakening, or the statements such as I am God, there is not one God but only God, or Hinduism is a monotheistic religion. In this paradigm, gurus and acharyas become saints and prophets, and we come across books such as Realizing God, Lectures on Vedanta, or the Bhagavad Gita, Royal Science of God Realization, where the quest has been to blur the parameters of Hinduism and Christianity and to make the Hindu texts such as Bhagavad Gita an equivalent to the Bible. A naive reading of perennialism gives us an impression that it supports harmony among cultures by flattening the religious terrains, buttressing the claim that all religions reveal the same truth or lead to the same God. But if we are to critically analyze these claims, what the narrators are affirming is the universalization of their own cultural experience or creating new hybrid forms of cultural experience. The fundamental problem with this approach lies in intolerance to difference, that cultural maxims are acceptable because they are the same no matter who the speakers are. The parameters of this paper encompass cultural difference, and analysis of the categories of God, Īśvara and the Brahman makes an exemplary case. On the social front, this approach makes a case for a mutual understanding, respect, empathy, or social recognition, for all these concepts are meaningless in a culturally homogenized terrain. But these are not some simple categories to follow a strict definition and draw comparisons. What God meant for the ancient Hebrew people is different from what it meant to Aquinas or Hegel. Equally problematic are the concepts of Īśvara and the Brahman. This vagueness has been a fertile ground for misconception. The objective here is to demonstrate an urgency for a critical gaze on these categories. But it is not possible for me to explore the range in which the categories Īśvara and the Brahman have been used in classical Hindu texts. For what is meant by Īśvara to Patanjali or by Shankara or what it means in the system of Nyaya or the Pashupata system are very different. For the sake of the scope of this paper, I am limiting myself to the Advaita of Shankara. There are two reasons in this limitation. One, the market Hinduism that makes God as equivalent to Brahman or sometimes to Īśvara has broadly appropriated Advaita categories, and the proponents of this equivalence are primarily from the school of Advaita. And two, the range of concepts used to define these categories, even within the Advaita of Shankara, buttress a case for a closer analysis of the categories across schools. In all accounts, this comparison alone is sufficient to demonstrate the flaws in the perennial approach of homogenizing the categories. While the category God is too broad to be analyzed in a few lines, I will start with a few defining parameters for the sake of comparison. And if the distinction between the philosopher's God and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is required to pursue this investigation, I will align this effort with the first, as I am examining central arguments in defense of God. What is God like? For God, we can always find marginal readings on God or the Brahman that make them almost identical. But to be honest and thorough, we have to rely on the mainstream understandings or broadly accepted categories. And if read accordingly, the category God is primarily understood in dualistic terms. God is perfect, meaning He is unsurpassable in power, knowledge, and goodness. He creates the world out of nothing, and He acts in history, for every single historical event unfolds according to His plan. While this God is disembodied, with all the anthropomorphic descriptions being read as negations, this God is endowed with desire and passion. What follows are a few of the core arguments presented in defense of God throughout the history of Christianity. Number one, God is the initial mover. This argument comes in various flavors, from Aristotle's unmoved mover to its appropriation in the theology of Aquinas. The argument is that change is possible, at least in its initial phase, only with the subject to change something. This unactualized actualizer is explained in the Aristotelian paradigm as one immutable, eternal, immaterial, incorporeal, perfect, omnipotent, and fully good. It's considered to be the case of the existence of things, as this is the being that keeps all entities in being from moment to moment. The above argument rests on the assumption that for an entity X to exist, God must exist. Rather than arguing for a cause, assuming God to be the initial cause rests on the assumption of change, that there must be an initial mover for change to occur. The above argument applies to the transcendentality of God, and there is no law that the category causality cannot apply to transcendental entity. The argument for a purely actual actualizer leads to the assumption that God is an unmovable mover, that there are no potentials within God that are yet to be actualized. The next point is, for all composite things to come into being, there must be a simple, non-composite one to cause the composites. And number three, the objects like universals or numbers must be true. These objects do not depend on material things for their existence, and so God is the ultimate ground for their existence. And number four, there must be pure existence that we can extract from the existence of entities in the world. This pure existence is God. And number five, there must be one necessary being for itself, and things that exist do exist for the reason as determined by this entity, God. Of course, there are different camps within Christian theology, with some stressing absolute perfection while others focusing on God's personhood. The second camp focuses on God's desire to be in dynamic relation with humanity. As it will be clear when we address the categories Brahman and Īśvara, this tension is not relevant in Advaita, as a clear distinction between Brahman and Īśvara makes it possible for both the immutable singularity of the Absolute while with personal engagement with creation of Īśvara. The categories of monism, pantheism and panentheism are not applicable if we are serious about reading Advaita. For the singularity of the Brahman is not that of all in one, but of pure singularity, and the concept of transcendence is relative and contradicts the non-duality of the Brahman. Furthermore, numeric one does not apply to Brahman, as it is not a countable entity. While there are other schools of thought within Hinduism that come close to panpsychism, with every particular in the cosmos being conscious, or cosmopsychism, that the cosmos as a whole has conscious states, the Advaita of Shankara underscores the singularity of consciousness, rejecting external properties to the pure being and luminosity of consciousness. As long as we are looking for consciousness in matter, we are not engaging Advaita. And if we are searching for materiality within consciousness, we are not understanding Advaita. It is therefore contextual that we engage the categories Brahman and Īśvara before making broader assumptions. So I'll skip a few sections and just jump to comparative analysis. Some scholars, for instance Harstone and Rees, have outlined the categories of being eternal, temporal, conscious, knower, and include the world to compass the Absolute in different cultures. Diller makes a case that the Absolute in Shankara's understanding meets 4 of the above criteria except for being temporal. Diller's assumption underlines that Brahman is eternal. However, in the above conversation, we have clarified that the word eternity is applied to refer to the Brahman only in the sense that it is not determined by the past or the future modes of time. This means that the word eternal in this context does not mean something constant, but only something that is not temporal. Brahman does not posit itself as an entity. It just is that it cannot be negated in any mode of time. The same applies to other positive attributes imposed on Brahman. Some are confused seeing the term consciousness, Chaitanya, describing the Brahman and make an assessment that Brahman is all-knowing. But the problem is, Brahman is not a conscious subject, but consciousness in itself, and does not possess any subjectivity. For the sake of comparison, some have argued that Brahman includes the world. This position also does not make sense from the Advaita perspective. When the Advaitins say that Brahman alone exists, they are not suggesting that the world exists within Brahman, just like the stars in the sky. Brahman is not a class within the world being its particular. The world is not a quality of the Brahman. One may then be tempted to compare God with Īśvara, for several of the categories addressed above are indeed applicable to Īśvara, who is the omniscient and all-powerful creator of the world. Accordingly, the category theocosm used to describe the world as identical to Brahman underscores only the positive attributes used to describe the Brahman, but fails to address the higher teachings where any conversation, particularly an affirming description, is a moot point. If someone says the snake is but a rope, that does not confirm the identity between the rope and the snake. The same way, if an Advaitin says the world is but the Brahman, this does not lead to theocosm. If our objective is to make an honest comparison, we first have to not impose the ideas that we like upon classical philosophers. As I have outlined above, the causality superimposed on Brahman is based solely on vivarta, an erroneous projection, and therefore the Brahman is not a material cause like clay for pots or an efficient cause like a potter making pots. And this is not even following ajati or drishti shrishti, the Advaita models that reject any form of causality. There is not a single model of Advaita that describes the Brahman as being the material and efficient cause in the literal sense. For the category vivarta or false projection is unequivocally advocated by all the Advaitins within the school of Shankara. The mother of all misconceptions is to read Advaita along the lines that Brahman intentionally self-multiplies to make the cosmos. What this entails is that the Brahman has both intentionality and the possibility of multiplication. That is, it is spatio-temporally determined, for only the entities that are spatio-temporally determined can multiply. The sky therefore cannot multiply. This also entails that Brahman has a subjectivity. In contrast, the Advaita texts constantly repeat that Maya, avidya, sometimes considered as identical and other times as slightly different, is the material cause for the world. All the narratives of creation are, in the absolute sense, a mere metaphor to describe that all that exists is Brahman alone. Therefore, neither the identification that Brahman is full or perfect, or the statement that the Brahman creates the world is nothing more than an interpretive device to instruct the singularity of the Brahman. On the other hand, we can adopt the Srishti-Drishti model and consider real causation of the world, and in that case, we'll have Īśvara as the cause for the world. Albeit, Īśvara does not create the world out of nothing, as he only allows the stimulation of karmas in the beginning of the creation cycle, so that the embodied beings can experience their corporeal presence and engage in the world accordingly. If God is an initial mover, Brahman is not, for the already stated reasons that it lacks subjectivity and it is motionless. If we want to consider Īśvara as an initial mover, there is nothing initial in the Hindu paradigm, as creation is cyclical and beginningless. Even when Īśvara is all-powerful, it is not perfect, for it becomes possible contingent upon Maya and its projection suspends. Basically, its reality collapses at the event of self-recognition. In the ultimate sense, Advaita rejects any possibility of motion, for the perfection of Brahman rests not just in it being changeless, a category also applicable to God, but also being non-agentive and non-temporal. If the argument is that Brahman is the most simple, non-composite one that causes all composite forms, we are imposing attributes applicable to material objects to the Brahman. The simplicity of Brahman is comparable to that of the sky, and the sky is not the simple substance that aggregates in giving rise to complex forms. Accordingly, Brahman is not a class, a universal, of which the world would be a particular. Brahman is neither a concept nor a substrate for concepts. From the perspective of pure existence and pure necessity, we can argue and equate God with Brahman. If the existence of things are to be derived from the pure basis of existence as the Brahman, Advaitins would have no objection to this argument, given that this is only for a conventional understanding of Brahman. For, in the absolute sense, the positive attribute of the existence of the Brahman is only in order to negate the positive presentation of negation, as would have maintained by the Madhyamaka philosophers. But even the criteria of being for itself doesn't apply to Brahman, as the Brahman is not a reason for the being of Brahman. Neither does the Brahman create the world for its purposes. Furthermore, if Brahman were to create the world for its purpose, this would make Brahman imperfect. Even in the case of Īśvara, his causality rests on karma, as he is agentive only in stimulating karmas and not in determining the fate for the embodied beings. Now, one may wonder, how can we advance the project of comparative theology by delineating the incompatibility of categories? The response is simple. Just like an entity can be defined by means of positive attributes, by means of affirmation, or by negative attributes by means of negation, our comparison does not require a common ground, a common understanding. If we initiate our discourse grounding on difference, we already accept originality in each culture. Our social harmony is not a product of flattening our differences. Advaita neither teaches that differences need to be expunged at the level of our conventional reality. Actually, conventional reality rests on the ground of difference. Our social coexistence depends on our ability to recognize our differences so that in the quest of finding universality, we stop imposing our perspectives onto the others. We can learn, modify, and refine our cultural categories, and for that, our cultural dialogues need to rest on the parameters of difference. Thank you so much.